It is the 2nd of May 2025, and inside a low industrial hangar in Luton, Bedfordshire, the air smells of machine oil and fresh paint. Rain taps against corrugated steel somewhere overhead. Engineers in Navy overalls move quietly around a portable rail launcher, checking connections with the unhurried precision of people who have rehearsed this moment many times before. On the rail sits something that, at first glance, looks almost too small to matter. A pale gray aircraft with a wingspan of little more than 3.5 meters, its fuselage no longer than a family car is wide. There are no markings to suggest menace, no pilot's canopy, no roar of an engine warming. And yet a small crowd has gathered to watch it, including the Prime Minister himself, Sir Keir Starmer, standing beside officials from the Ministry of Defense and executives from two companies who, until recently, few members of the public could have named. Photographers wait. Someone gives a nod. Within seconds, the aircraft is gone, flung from its launcher into the gray Bedfordshire sky with a hiss of compressed air, climbing away over the rooftops of the town where its most important component was built. What has just taken off is the first of a new class of British military drone, one built not to fight, not to spy in the traditional sense, but to make an enemy's own eyes fail. It is called StormShroud, and though nobody watching it disappear into the cloud that afternoon could have described its full significance in a single sentence, they were witnessing the moment the Royal Air Force formally re-entered a form of warfare it had quietly abandoned more than a decade earlier, and did so with a machine built from lessons paid for in blood and wreckage on the battlefields of Ukraine. To understand why this small, unglamorous aircraft mattered, it helps to understand the problem it was built to solve, a problem that had been growing for years and had become, by the early 2020s, one of the most urgent facing every Western Air Force. Modern warfare in the air is no longer decided simply by which pilot flies the faster jet or fires the sharper missile. It is decided increasingly by radar and by the vast layered networks of ground-based sensors and surface-to-air missile systems that can detect an aircraft long before its crew ever sees the threat. Russia had spent decades building precisely such a network, a web of radar stations and missile batteries designed to make its airspace, and the airspace of any territory it controlled, lethal to intruding aircraft. Historians of Cold War strategy will recognize the shape of the problem. It is the same one that drove the United States to develop its wild weasel tactics over Vietnam and, later, dedicated jamming aircraft like the EA-18G Growler. Britain had once possessed its own answer in the form of the Alarm anti-radiation missile, a weapon designed to home in on and destroy enemy radar emitters, used to notable effect during the Gulf War and again over Kosovo and Libya. But Alarm was retired from RAF service in 2013, and with it went a dedicated national capability for what military planners call the Suppression of Enemy Air Defenses, or SEAD. For more than a decade afterwards, the RAF had no bespoke tool of its own for silencing an enemy's radar picture before sending in crewed aircraft. That gap might have remained an abstract concern for defense planners had it not been for the war that began in February 2022. Ukraine's skies and Russia's became a live laboratory for exactly the kind of contested, radar-saturated environment that Western air forces had long theorized about but rarely experienced directly. Manned combat aircraft on both sides suffered heavily wherever they flew near intact, well-defended air defense networks, while cheap, expendable drones proved able to survive, adapt, and keep flying in numbers that no traditional jet could match. Reports from the front line described entire categories of expensive Russian and Ukrainian aircraft being withheld from certain missions altogether, their commanders unwilling to risk a scarce, highly trained pilot against a modern integrated air defense network that could track, classify, and engage a target within seconds of it appearing on radar. British defense officials watched closely, and the lesson they drew was not a comfortable one. NATO's own aircraft, however advanced, were not immune to the same mathematics. If the Typhoon and the newly arriving F-35B Lightning were ever required to operate against an adversary of Russia's sophistication, close air defense networks stacked with long-range surface-to-air missiles, mobile radar vehicles, and layered early warning systems, they would need a way to blind that adversary's radar first, and they would need it without placing another generation of pilots inside the most dangerous piece of airspace on the map. Rebuilding a dedicated SEAD capability from scratch using traditional methods, a new missile, a new crewed jamming jet, a new fleet with its own training pipeline, would likely have taken the better part of a decade and cost several billion pounds, a timeline and a budget that Britain, watching a war unfold in real time on the edge of Europe, judged it could no longer afford. The answer that emerged did not come from a single laboratory or a single company, but from an unusually fast and unusually collaborative effort stitched together in well under a year. At its center sat the RAF's Rapid Capabilities Office, working alongside the Catalyst team within Defense Equipment and Support, the government's Defense Science and Technology Laboratory, and two industrial partners drawn from opposite ends of the aerospace trade. The first was Tekever, a British-Portuguese company that had, almost unnoticed by the wider public, become one of the most battle-tested drone manufacturers in Europe by supplying its AR-3 aircraft to Ukraine's armed forces, where the airframe had already logged more than 10,000 operational flight hours and been refined through over 100 rounds of iterative upgrades based directly on frontline feedback. The AR-3 itself is a modest machine by the standards of military aviation, a fixed-wing aircraft with a wingspan of roughly 3.5 meters and a length under 2, weighing in the region of 25 kilograms fully loaded, capable of being launched from a portable catapult rail rather than a runway, cruising at somewhere between 75 and 90 kilometers an hour, and able to remain airborne for as long as 16 hours, while communicating out to a range of around 100 kilometers. None of those figures would impress anyone used to thinking of military aircraft in terms of Mach numbers and afterburners. That, in a sense, was the point. The second partner was Leonardo UK, whose engineers in Luton had spent years developing an entirely different kind of technology, a compact electronic warfare payload named BriteStorm, weighing barely 2.5 kilograms, small enough to be tucked inside the AR-3's slender fuselage, yet powerful enough to disrupt enemy radar systems across a wide span of radio frequencies. BriteStorm drew on know-how first proven in Leonardo's earlier BriteCloud missile decoy, under development since 2017, and used a technique known as digital radio frequency memory, or DRFM, which allows the system to capture an enemy radar's own signal, manipulate it, and transmit it back in a way that can conjure false targets or a whole false formation of aircraft where none exist. Engineers describe the overall approach as stand-in jamming, a term worth pausing on, because it captures precisely what made this project different from anything the RAF had fielded before. Traditional electronic warfare aircraft, of the kind used by the Americans or, in earlier decades, by the RAF's own tornado squadrons, typically loiter at a safe distance and project their jamming signals from afar, a method that grows less effective as enemy radar technology improves its resistance to distant interference. A stand-in jammer instead flies directly into the contested airspace alongside, or just ahead of, the aircraft it is protecting, getting close enough to an enemy radar to disrupt it at the source, rather than shouting over it from a safe remove. Think of the difference between trying to talk over a noisy room from the doorway and walking directly up to the loudest voice in that room and speaking into their ear. The closer the source, the less power is needed to overwhelm it, and the harder it becomes for the listener to filter out the interference. That, in essence, is what BriteStorm's digital radio frequency memory technology allows the drone to do at a distance, measured in mere kilometers, rather than the tens or hundreds of kilometers separating a traditional jamming aircraft from its target. Manufacturing the two components together, airframe in West Wales and Southampton, payload in Luton, the joint British industrial effort produced a working system in under a year, an extraordinarily short timeline for a genuinely new class of military technology, and one that officials openly credited to the accelerated pace of learning coming out of the war in Ukraine. Engineers involved in the program have since described the compressed development schedule as itself part of the innovation, arguing that a system designed to be rapidly upgraded and cheaply replaced could not have been built through the slow, exhaustive procurement processes that had traditionally governed British military aircraft, processes more suited to platforms expected to remain in frontline service for 30 or 40 years, than to a drone intended to evolve every few months in step with the threats it was built to counter. StormShroud entered formal RAF service on that gray afternoon in Luton, assigned to 216 Squadron at RAF Waddington in Lincolnshire, a unit newly designated as Britain's home for autonomous collaborative platforms and for what the service calls loyal wingman technology. In practice, this means the drones are intended to launch from the ground ahead of a mission, fly into contested airspace before the crewed Typhoon FGR-4 and F-35B Lightning aircraft arrive, and use BriteStorm to degrade the radar picture of any air defense system in the vicinity, opening a corridor through which the manned aircraft can operate with a significantly reduced chance of being detected or targeted. The Ministry of Defense committed an initial £19 million to the program, describing it as directly supporting some 200 skilled engineering jobs spread across sites from West Wales to Somerset, and confirmed that the first squadron would operate an initial fleet of 24 aircraft, with Tekever already capable of producing hundreds of AR-3 airframes a year and scope to scale production further still. Officials were careful to frame the moment not as a single deployment, but as the beginning of a family of platforms, the first of what the RAF calls its autonomous collaborative platforms, intended to grow into a wider suite of uncrewed systems working alongside piloted aircraft by the end of the decade. Air Chief Marshal Sir Rich Knighton, Chief of the Air Staff, described the moment as a seminal one for the service, arguing that autonomous collaborative platforms would come to reshape everything from intelligence gathering to strike missions and logistical support in the years ahead. Personnel drawn from the regular RAF and the Royal Auxiliary Air Force, supported by the RAF Regiment, were assigned to operate the new system, a deliberate choice reflecting how closely StormShroud's day-to-day handling would resemble ground-based operations as much as traditional flying duties, with drones catapulted from field-deployable rail launchers rather than taxied down a runway. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. Set against its international counterparts, StormShroud occupies a distinctive place. The United States has long relied on the EA-18G Growler, a purpose-built, crewed jamming aircraft derived from the F/A-18 Super Hornet, capable of carrying powerful, long-range jamming pods and anti-radiation missiles, but costing many tens of millions of pounds per airframe and requiring a trained crew to fly directly into danger. Russia, for its part, has invested heavily in ground-based systems such as the Krasukha family of jammers, powerful but static or semi-mobile installations designed to blind enemy sensors from fixed positions rather than accompany aircraft into the fight. StormShroud sits in neither tradition. It carries no missiles and no crew, and at a fraction of the cost of a crewed jamming jet, it is designed to be genuinely attritable, a machine the RAF can afford to lose in numbers that would be unthinkable for a Growler or a Typhoon. Where American doctrine still leans on the idea of a large, valuable jamming platform surviving through standoff distance and escort protection, and where Russian doctrine leans on static, layered ground defense, Britain's approach borrows directly from what Ukraine's improvised drone war demonstrated. that mass, adaptability, and low unit cost can, in the right circumstances, achieve results that expensive, exquisite platforms cannot guarantee alone. Whether this proves superior in a full-scale conflict against a peer adversary remains inevitably untested, and defense analysts continue to debate how a small stand-in jammer would fare against the most advanced Russian air defense networks under sustained combat conditions rather than in trials over British airspace. The wider significance of StormShroud reaches beyond its immediate battlefield role. Its introduction in May 2025 marked the practical beginning of the RAF's Autonomous Collaborative Platform Strategy, a doctrine shift that mirrors developments underway across NATO, from the United States' own Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program to similar loyal wingman projects in Australia and elsewhere in Europe. It also sits alongside a broader and, at times, painful transition within British military aviation away from legacy crewed and semi-autonomous systems that had simply been overtaken by events. The Army's long-serving Watchkeeper drone, built by Thales UK and Elbit Systems and in service since 2014, was judged by 2026 to be too dated for modern demands and is being retired in favor of Tekever's newer AR-5 under the Project Corvus program, a decision that reflects the same underlying lesson driving StormShroud. That the pace of change demonstrated in Ukraine had rendered older assumptions about drone capability and cost obsolete almost overnight. Historians of technology will likely look back on this period as one in which cheap, iterative, software-updatable systems began to outpace exquisite decades-in-development platforms, a shift with implications reaching well beyond any single aircraft type. BriteStorm itself, having entered low-rate initial production later in 2025, is designed with a modular, reprogrammable architecture, specifically so that it can be updated to counter new radar threats as they emerge. An approach that treats electronic warfare less as a finished weapon and more as a continuously evolving piece of software, married to a simple, disposable airframe. Return for a moment to that damp afternoon in Luton, to the small gray aircraft vanishing into low cloud above a town better known for its airport than its armaments. It would have been easy to dismiss what happened there as a minor procurement announcement, one more line in a defense budget, one more press release destined to be forgotten within the week. But it represented something considerably larger than its modest airframe suggested. It represented an air force acknowledging, quietly and without fanfare, that a capability it had allowed to lapse in 2013 was now urgently needed again, and that the fastest, most credible way to rebuild that capability was not through another decade-long program of exquisite crewed aircraft, but through a partnership between a small Anglo-Portuguese drone maker whose aircraft had already proven themselves under fire in Ukraine, and a British electronic warfare specialist willing to shrink years of missile decoy expertise into a payload light enough to be flung off a portable rail launcher by two engineers in the rain. It represented, too, a broader and more uncomfortable truth that the war in Ukraine had forced upon every Western defense ministry, that the future of contested airspace would likely belong not to the largest or most expensive machine in the sky, but to whichever side could field enough small, adaptable, expendable ones to open a path for everything else that followed. Exact figures on how StormShroud will perform against the most sophisticated air defense networks in a real, sustained conflict remain, by necessity, unknown, and historians and analysts will continue to debate how much of its promise reflects genuine capability and how much reflects the optimism that accompanies any new system on the day of its unveiling. What can be said with confidence is that the aircraft launched that afternoon in Bedfordshire carried with it more than a jamming payload. It carried the accumulated, hard-won understanding of a war being fought hundreds of miles away, translated within months into hardware, and sent aloft as a quiet answer to a question the Royal Air Force had left unanswered for more than 10 years. Consider, too, what the aircraft did not carry that afternoon, It carried no bombs, no missiles, nothing designed to kill in the way that armies had traditionally understood killing. Its entire purpose was to deceive, to confuse, to buy a few crucial seconds of doubt inside an enemy radar operator's mind, seconds in which a Typhoon or an F-35B might slip past unseen and complete a mission that would otherwise have cost lives on both sides. There is a quiet, almost old-fashioned kind of ingenuity in that, a reminder that the history of air warfare has never been solely a history of bigger engines and heavier payloads, but also of ever more inventive ways to hide, to mislead, and to survive. From the tinfoil chaff dropped by bomber crews in the Second World War, to the electronic decoys of the Cold War, and now to a 25-kilogram drone carrying a 2.5-kilogram jammer built from software as much as hardware, the underlying instinct has remained remarkably constant even as the tools have transformed beyond recognition. Exact numbers on how many StormShroud aircraft will ultimately enter service and how the wider autonomous collaborative platform program will evolve by the decade's end remain uncertain, dependent on budgets, threats, and lessons still being written in real time on battlefields that show no sign of falling silent. In the end, the story of StormShroud is not really the story of a single drone at all. It is the story of an old vulnerability, patiently rebuilt into a new advantage, launched not with the roar of an engine, but with the soft hiss of compressed air, disappearing into an ordinary gray sky that, for a moment, held rather more history than it appeared to.